Good morning, everyone. This morning, I will be presenting to you the cataloging and classification, the readers of the month, the star reader, and the list of recommended books for the third quarter for your library reading activity. So, my dear students, sit back, listen, and watch the video.
You may have heard these words or terms in watching the history of ancient cataloging. The catalog and the materials they listed both were in primal forms: clay tablets, inscriptions, and papyrus rolls. Let's move to another part of history of cataloging and classification. We have already learned the ancient history. So are we going to learn the history of modern and contemporary cataloging and classification? Not yet. For today's lesson, we will be going to the Dark Ages. Oh, what's this you say? This is a traveling machine. You will be going along with me to head back to the times where monastic libraries were established. Look at the town, the ships, and the tall structures far ahead. At this time, new social and cultural forces reshaped the European civilization and affected the organization of libraries. I can't believe I'm in the medieval period. I know you're also excited to learn what happened in the Middle Ages. You're about to learn and revisit cataloging in medieval libraries. The Middle Ages have left fuller material evidence for library practices than that available for the ancient world. The Middle Ages of library history can be set at the turn from the 5th to the 6th centuries and extend to the Reformation, which marked the end of medieval libraries. The cardinal force was Christianity, which not only permeated the worldview of much of the population, but also provided the primary institutional settings for education and cultivation of intellectual life. Education took place primarily in schools, associated with monasteries and cathedrals. Thus, the evidence of library classification in medieval Europe comes primarily from the book inventories of monasteries and university colleges, as well as book lists of the private libraries of scholarly individuals living within those milieu. Really, a monastery without books is like fort without arms. Due to this, the monks considered to set up a library as large as possible. This reflection started with the mighty deed of a whole catalog, consisting of a sequence of single catalogs of different libraries. Library cataloging reveals how those entrusted with the care of books thought about the books, and, just as interesting, how they thought about the knowledge contained in the books. The types of documentation can provide clues to the use and understanding of books, such as financial accounts, wills, and inscriptions in the book themselves, but they do not reveal the intellectual work of description, classification, and organization. Traditional library history has outlined cataloging as a progression from crude inventories to subject cataloging. Medieval librarians were driven by utilitarian needs to develop cataloging practices that could work in their particular situations. In summarizing the history of medieval European catalogs, Norris describes things with this economy of words. The first 10 centuries of the Christian era tell us little of libraries or their catalogs. No medieval treatise on cataloging exists today, and it is rarely possible to determine individual responsibility for library catalogs. But within the extant documentation, individual thinkers often emerge as people solving interesting problems. There are two notable catalogs from this era that seem to have taken inspiration from the ancient catalog of Edfu in Egypt. The first was engraved in marble for all to see, and the second on paper. The history of cataloging and classification represents a sharp contrast to the problems and challenges of today. Cataloging and classification involve a massive task in our information age. Its history goes back to the age before presses, when books were handwritten and very few in number. Researching the history of medieval cataloging, of course, requires researching library catalogs themselves. This is hampered by the fact that inventories and catalogs of libraries rarely appear in printed editions, and when they do appear, typesetting and print conventions mean valuable manuscript evidence is lost. Therefore, much scholarship relies heavily on synthesis sources, survey articles, and a few individual examples of collections. A working definition of catalogs: guides to the content and location of the books available for use, can serve as a basis for understanding these documents. Due to the absence of theoretical or practical works, individual compilers of catalog apparently had to work out for themselves how to provide access to titles if they desired. Roughly analogous to cataloging, a small library without recourse to Anglo-American cataloging rules or the Library of Congress files. Despite this disorganization, which seems daunting to modern catalogers, many comprehensive intellectual systems for organizing volumes do survive in medieval documents. In fact, since cooperation was virtually unknown in the insular monastic and cathedral libraries of the Middle Ages, standardization was less important and less desirable than in the 20th century environment. The development of the medieval libraries paralleled that of cultural history in general, so surviving medieval library catalogs reflect the development of intellectual life in the West. The book of the Middle Ages is the Parchment Codex and was the property of religious organizations. It is essentially an ancient book consisting of one or more quires of sheets of papyrus or parchment folded together to form a group of leaves or pages. In the early Middle Ages, liturgical books were highly valued and respected because of their association with the Mass. The Middle Ages was taken by the monastic libraries. As the major instruments of education in the Middle Ages, monasteries served by the cause of collecting, producing, and preserving the books useful in the learning of the clerics. The number of volumes in the medieval collection was modest. Medium-sized collections had a few hundred volumes, and many smaller monasteries had only a few dozen. By the end of the 9th century, larger collections contained 300 to 500 volumes, with Bobbio having almost 700. A 10th century catalog from Lorsch shows 590 manuscripts, and the 12th century library at Cluny lists 500 to 600 volumes. The famous monastic collections of Reichenau and St. Gall listed 100 codices in the year 1100, and the most impressive papal library at Avignon contained 2,000 volumes. Cassiodorus is a Roman statesman, renowned scholar of antiquity, and writer serving in the administration of Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths. The famous work, Institutions of Cassiodorus, from the 6th century, was intended to serve as a scholarly model with an annotated guide to what was valuable reading of the times. The need of catalogue was not felt. Pope Gregory I, commonly known as Gregory the Great, was the Bishop of Rome from the 3rd of September 590 to his death. A list of books given by Gregory the Great in the 8th century AD to the Church of St. Clements in Rome was the earliest of the monastic library catalogues. It was a marble tablet with an introduction or prayer and a few biblical works inscribed on it. A third example is De Trinitate of St. Augustine, which too was a simple list of works transcribed on the flyleaf of a work. The medieval monastic libraries broke from traditional procedures of the libraries of antiquity by following the regulations of religious orders, such as the Rule of Saint Benedict. The Rule of Saint Benedict is a book of precepts written for monks living communally under the authority of an abbot. One chapter of the rule prescribed that inventories be taken of the monastery's possessions, including books. The armarius, or now known as the librarian, was the one who catalogued and cared for the books. The primary duty of the armarius was to orchestrate the operation of the rooms for the library and the scriptorium, which included keeping an inventory, inspecting holdings, regulating their use, and overseeing the copyists. Let's move on to the age of inventory. Luis Pius issued a decree requiring the monasteries and cathedrals to list all the books in their possession. So the catalogues of the monasteries and cathedrals were compiled to serve the need for inventories of the material possession. Efforts were made in compiling inventories. The inventory catalog was the simplest type of catalog. For many monasteries, inventories reveal that books were indeed seen within the context of the monastery treasures. While these often appear to be little more than a collection of titles, they can reveal many important details about book use, especially when they were compiled over time. Inventories are seen as functional documents designed more to keep track of titles than a comprehensive system for organizing physical volumes and the texts within them. Regarding the taking of inventories and cataloging of manuscripts, Karl Christ says, "There are no known examples of formal, written rules from the Middle Ages describing how a catalog of books was to be made. Nothing of this type has survived, either from any of the religious orders. It is possible that none have ever existed. So what we know of such catalogs must be inferred from the few surviving inventory lists which do not show consistent arrangement, format, or logic. Even the late medieval books which delineated the duties of libraries don't specify how a collection was to be catalogued." Medieval library catalogs were really inventory lists or accession lists of current holdings to keep track of the books in case of loss. However, this kind of listing isn't the same concept with modern cataloging. These catalogs listed the books by author and title, which was simply a copy of the book's exterior label along with other prominent physical characteristics. If the author and the title of the book were not known, the opening words of the books or the text were listed. If not by author and title, the books were arranged by the importance of their work, in the order of the Bible, other religious works, and secular works. Contents were not indicated in the case of collections, or works of the same author and works of various authors on the same subject held together, as was the practice. The most basic type of classification in medieval catalogs is the division and physical storage among books with different uses. The spendment or chancery in Durham Cathedral second catalog, where books were stored, was divided by an iron grille. Books in the inner portion were restricted in use and numbered 87, while the outer portion contained 428 items and was accessible to any monk. In addition to organization of titles, medieval catalogs provide a varying degree of physical description. Short description, such as that of the Durham Library Catalog in the 12th century, is limited to the number of volumes, the size, and the completeness of the set. Sometimes, descriptive information seems frivolous and is of frustratingly little use to modern historians. San Martino Alcimino's monastic library also held books scattered throughout the premises according to need. For example, the 1394 catalog of Trinity Hall from Cambridge gives us details such as big and pretty, which probably would not help distinguish one volume from another. In other cases, the detail suggests the care with which books were regarded, as is the case in 15th century Cistercian documents resulting from an ordinance of 1456, which describe books' material, binding, and general state. Later, university libraries also utilized physical subdivision as a basic form of classification. The Sorbonne's Magna Libraria and Libraria Parva were basic divisions, arising from the growth and diversification of the library collections. Statutes from the 14th century make it clear that the two collections were stored in different rooms with different keys. It can be argued that this division arose because older libraries were largely restricted to theological works, while the new universities stocked both secular and religious texts and had a responsibility to a larger and more diverse base of patrons. Simple location descriptions could also be assigned to provide access to volumes. This could be as transparent as a chest-by-chest description of where to find a particular volume. The chained volumes so familiar to medievalists were often not listed in early documents, probably because they did not need to be kept track of. However, later, catalogs do include them, and while it is usually assumed that it is to prevent theft, it seems just as likely it is to ensure communal access, much like holding books on reserve at a central location. Catalogers also used a variety of techniques to indicate specific locations. Here, the notion of shelf listing came into play. Often, catalogers assigned letters of the alphabet to volumes or gave precise descriptions of the shelf on which volumes could be found. Interesting mnemonic schemes may also have been developed to aid retrieval. The practice beginning in the early 14th century was to record the opening words of a certain page, often the second or third page of the manuscript, along with the last words of the page at the end of the manuscript. This method of listing texts probably originated at the Library of Sorbonne in Paris, France, and reflected the medieval cataloging as serving an inventory function rather than a literary aid. Possible explanations range from preventing substitution of cheaper volumes for more expensive ones to distinguishing between copies of the same work. While many very brief catalogs do not give this information, it seems that even medieval librarians who are not dealing with the exact print duplicates created by mechanized printing realized that it could be necessary to distinguish among copies of the same text, either for their own purposes or for the users of the library. Sometimes, catalogs contained helpful notes in the margins or between the lines, such as opinion on the value of individual texts, notes on the condition of the manuscript, notes about loans and conditions upon the return of the volumes. If the volume contained expensive fittings, such as parchment, gold and silver lettering, exceptional miniatures, bindings decorated with gold or silver, carved ivory, and precious stones. A manuscript's format was not usually noted by the armarius unless it was abnormal. However, this information was usually entered by the end of the Middle Ages. The material used for the manuscript, either paper or parchment, is noted. Purchase prices were rarely entered in catalogs or in the manuscripts themselves, but do appear in records of purchases. The amount reflected the cost of replacement. Order of entries were arranged without a fixed system. Many are merely consecutive numbering of manuscripts without proper grouping. Many catalogs tried to combine similar items and to identify these groups with a symbol. However, this subject organization was ineffective because of individual volumes which combined writings from different subject areas. Here is the order of entries in a typical medieval catalog. First is the Bible and parts of the Bible, followed by writings of the Church Fathers in varying sequences, followed by medieval theologians, followed by ancient authors, and followed by works in the liberal arts. An alphabetical arrangement by author's name is seldom found. One example of arrangement is provided by Richard de Fournival in his mid-13th century Biblionomia. Here, he followed the academic subjects at Sorbonne in listing, arranging, and marking books in his library. However, each library seemed to follow its own organization, unique from other libraries. In the late Middle Ages, some catalogs included manuscripts labeled Secundam Pulpeta, translating second table. During this period, the simplest and most obvious way to arrange books in the catalog was in the order in which they were shelved. Call numbers were used on many of the books. The specific ways in which digits and letters were combined to form call numbers help identify the original holding library of a manuscript. Since manuscripts often lacked ownership marks, the identification aspects of these unique call numbers is important. Sometimes, valuable manuscripts were bound into catalogs or written on the blank leaves of a Bible to protect them from theft. The medieval library catalog primarily served the librarian to guard against property loss, to audit the collection, and to transfer the care of the books to a successor. The user of a library rarely used the catalog, but rather consulted the armarius. Among the French libraries, the catalogue of the library under Charles VI was remarkable. In addition to listing the beginning and ending of the texts, it also lists the opening words of the second and final leaves of a manuscript. In short, it concentrates on the physical description of the manuscript while ignoring its content. This indicates that the book is noted as a treasure and not as an intellectual one. An example of a 14th century English catalogue was a Norwich Cathedral Priory. It appears to have produced a catalogue in year 1315. It was arranged so the titles were grouped under the names of donors and not according to a subject arrangement. The books themselves can be grouped according to their identifying markings. In this case, the important aspect for catalogue arrangement was the donor of the book and not the contents. This indicates that the book is noted with its value as a donation and not as an intellectual one. The catalogue of the Priory of Christ Church suggests subject classification. This fragment, containing 223 items, does not indicate where in this monastery the books would be found. Nevertheless, even though there are no subject headings given, there is a definite system of subjectival classification. The subjects are presented in the following order: grammar, rhetoric, music, philosophy, poetry, astronomy, miscellaneous, logic, dialectic, and law. In England, the library of St. Augustine's Abbey rivaled and perhaps surpassed that of Christ Church. Tracing the evolution of its library catalogue is impossible, as the only document dates to 1947. This shows that books were classified under 16 headings: Bibles and other religious works, natural history, philosophy, music, geometry, astronomy, medicine, logic, grammar, poetry, books in French and English, alchemy, miscellaneous items, and the canon law, with no mention of civil law. A final type of catalogue is union list, or combined catalogue of several libraries' holdings. These are usually considered a modern invention, but an interesting medieval example, though incomplete, does exist. Medieval librarians devised ingenious and often unique ways to solve the problems in their own libraries. As the use of books changed and their numbers increased, so did the way in which catalogues were compiled, and there are outstanding examples both of negligence and thoroughness from all periods. One can easily recognize the process in modern cataloging from its medieval roots. No longer is cataloging solely an inventory list, but also a subject index guide for the patron. No longer is the catalog solely for the use of the librarian, but more for the patron. The focus now in catalog is on the subject contents, rather than the physical characteristics, except with rare books. The catalog continues to evolve to being what the great bibliographer William Thomas Lowndes described in 1834 as the intellectual mariner's compass of learning. I hope you learned a lot in today's discussion. See you in another lesson!
Thank you for listening. Stay safe and God bless us all.